For early access plus exclusive content, facilitated discussions, live one-on-one Q&As, and more, become a patron at patreon.com/BrucePointset. Welcome back to the Church of Can't Stop, Won't Stop. I'm your host, Bruce Pointset, and this is the series where we use Can't Stop, Won't Stop, a hip-hop history by Jacque, as a jump off to talk about the Portland and Oregon hip-hop story and with a special guest. And today I have with me, teacher, poet, mother, MC, activist, maybe not all in that order, but Jacque Dixon. How are you doing today?
What's up, y'all? I'm good. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here with y'all.
Yeah, so I already made one mistake because I was actually going to try and be slick and not do my own intro to you because I was in a hip hop, or I was guest teaching for a hip hop lit class, and one of the students actually interviewed you and had, I think, one of my favorite intros, which I'm just going to read real quick. So hopefully you're not
cool.
too self-conscious.
Start over.
Yeah. Oh, no. We're all sorry, but you just wrote in there. During my research about Jacque, I found out that she's not only an artist, but a high school teacher, an activist, and a mother, a whole superwoman. It is beyond amazing to see women in our community accomplish so much. This inspires young females to follow their dreams. She wants to make a difference in our community, and she stands up against police brutality. And I share that, because I think it's one thing from, those of us in like a professional community or whatever, but there's a real power in, that validation from students, and especially for you as a teacher, being able to connect even with someone, outside of your class who's reaching out. Like, I think that was pretty awesome. So Thank you. That, today, again, we're doing the Church of Can't Stop, Won't Stop. And for this episode, I've chosen the chapter All in the Same Gang, the War on Youth and the Quest for Unity, which basically it comes in about right after the LA riots and really like talks about basically the after effects of the gang truce, and specifically, the creativity that kind of came from that moment when people were, things calmed down and people were just working together, as well as, a real push for economic empowerment. And then as the second half of the chapter is more so about the culture war and pushback against hip hop from a political side, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But just to bring it back to the truce, one of the things that Jacque really hones in on is just how, in this aftermath, you had people, former rivals and whatnot, really just being able to relax and spend time together and like find that, creativity, especially, in the context of hip hop. And this might be a little bit of a stretch here, but it kind of reminded me of an interview I did with OG1 a while back, where he talked about just the vibe of Portland as a big city is slower than other cities, and it gives an opportunity for creativity for a lot of artists, or for a lot of artists to really explore their creativity more so, as opposed to, just the hustle and bustle of like major labels and just everything else that's happening in the city. But it got me thinking about, you were part of the group Rose Bent, who, as were like the first ladies of Portland hip hop for a minute. And, I just wanted to, just one, because you went to school in Milwaukee, right?
Yeah, high school. Yeah.
So I was curious, like how, like how did hip hop kind of come into your life? Like what kind of brought you, what made you fall in love with the culture and the music?
Right on. Well, I took I guess a non-traditional track in high school. I was a teen parent, and I don't want to go too deep into it, but Milwaukee definitely had its issues, still does, I guess, with white supremacy. And when I was in high school, like it was a known fact, you know, that there were skinheads, white supremacists, folks who I went to school with, or who, like, you know, terrorized folks that look like me or you at school. And so for me, a lot of the time, the frustrations that I would find, whether they were coming from like dealing with racist incidents at school, or they were coming from like the stresses of being a teen parent, or um, you know, just being a teenager, period. Like writing for me was always an outlet. And I think I started like creatively expressing myself like through journaling and writing poetry and things like that, probably around like the age of 13, 14. Um, you know, golden era, you know, hip hop, 90s hip hop. Like I connected with a lot of the music and the movement and just the message of like self-expression. And I think the rebel in me as well, like connected with a lot of like, yeah, like I'm down with that, you know. Put Pac back on, like let me, you know, I just identified with that. And I skipped a lot of school, and I didn't necessarily always hang out in my neighborhood. I was kicking it a lot of time in Southeast. At the time, we called it like Felony Flats, Felony Flats finest, you know. So um, definitely around some activity, not always gang related, but at times definitely exposed to that, and drugs and just, you know, things that weren't probably helping me be on track with school. So how did I find hip hop? I guess I connected in that way. And then I was in a relationship at some point, like in my late teens. So, you know, I had my son at 16, and ended up graduating at 17, and then was continuing with the writing. Like it was just, for me, it was kind of like therapy when I came home, you know, after a long day of work, school, parenting. Like I'd sit down and write it out, you know, just it was stress relief. And I was in a relationship with someone who was both a producer and a rapper. And so I think it was suggested at some point, you know, like, oh wow, like that poem's dope, like why don't you come lay it down in the studio, or like maybe you would want to feature on this track. And you know, I was like, I'm not a rapper, I'm a poet, like I can't do that, you know. And I guess just once it started, it was addicting. It was like another outlet, another creative outlet. And oh, okay, I could turn this poem into 16 bars, and then, you know, this is like another way to express myself. And so just kind of took off from there. I, you know, couldn't stop once I started. Loved it. So
Yeah. So with that, like when did you connect with the other women of Rose Bent?
I think I connected with Kiyoshi probably in like my early 20s, Lady Trinity. She used to go by Lady Trinity. And we just saw each other on the scene. Like I was doing solo music. So I used the stage name J Chronic. A lot of Portland folks know me as J Chronic from those times. And I was rocking shows a lot with like the Trash Heap crew back in the day. Three white dudes from Southeast. And then I would work with like various producers too, you know. So like I met Cool Nuts, I met OG1, like, you know, the OGs on the scene, who basically like took me under their wing and were like, oh, you got chops, you know, like you want to get on this show, or, you know. So I don't even remember where Kiyoshi and I met. Like it could have been a po-hop, you know. I definitely played a lot of po-hops back in the day. But I definitely noticed like, oh, there's another woman, you know, there's another B girl like doing her thing, like she's dope, I gotta go talk to her. So that's how we met. and we were both just doing solo music and always surrounded by men. You know, at all those shows. And so we linked up, and sometimes I would rock backups for her. Sometimes she would rock backups for me, and that's just kind of how we connected. And then I met Miss Chief years later. I don't know when, like maybe in the 2000, late 2000s, like 2009, 2008. She was recording over at Kiyoshi's. Wolverine was one of the producers Kiyoshi was working with a lot. He, you know, worked with Bosco back in the day, and he's produced for a lot of like old school cats from Portland for sure. Got that like classic West Coast sound. And so I think Miss Chief was recording with Wolverine pretty regularly, and Kiyoshi had like threw this idea out there, like, hey, you know, we're all stressed out, we're all going through the same thing, trying to like manage home life, parenting, school, careers. Like, what if we come together as a force, you know, and we could support each other? Because I think at that point too, I had kind of like, I chilled out. Like, I was still writing a lot, but I had chilled out on shows and was just like, I don't know if this is really like something I have time for right now. Like, I'm always gonna write because I love it, but you know, there's other things you deal with like on the scene as a woman, especially back then. Like, I think some things have changed for sure, but just a lot of sexism, a lot of and not even necessarily just on my own scene. Like, I remember flying out to Memphis and meeting with a small record label and just dealing with some really awkward, like unsafe, not cool situations as a woman. And I, you know, I was just kind of fed up with it. So Kiyoshi had the idea of us bringing it all together as three strong women, and that's kind of where Rose Bend started. Yeah.
What's up? And you know, I was curious, like when you look at the scene now, you see a number of different women in Portland hip hop are really like very much at like the forefront of it. Like that's got to be. I'm curious how you feel about, you know, just seeing that.
It's dope. I mean, I remember seeing Karma Rivera in her early stages too, like when she was just a baby MC, kind of like, you know, open enough shows here and there, and I was like, oh, she's dope, you know. And like seeing what she's doing now is amazing, and I'm proud of her, you know. Not like I know her like that really, but just like I've seen it and I've seen the growth, and I appreciate it and respect it, for sure. Like it's just mind-blowing. That's dope. I mean, Raquel, help me out with the last name.
Devar?
Yes, Raquel Devar. She's dope. I know I've seen some of her stuff too, and I'm like, damn, where did all these MCs come from? Like, it's dope. She's dope. Lisa Vasquez, like I definitely respect her production skills. So kind of just peeping those three, and I know there's more I'm forgetting. Sorry, it was a long day at work, but it's dope. It's exciting.
Yeah, like I said, it's just you know, again, just honing on kind of that theme of just the creativity that's really like sparking up now. It's awesome. And you know, you talk about Kiyoshi, and you know, she's also heavy in the community. And I think
Yeah.
that's one of the things that's really awesome about Portland, like both in regards to like teachers, like in the classroom in school districts specifically, but also just kind of like educators in general. There's a lot of people in the hip hop community who are, you know, really, really involved as far as like basically being, you know, role models, teachers, you know, there for these young people. And I think it's not a coincidence from that. They have, you know, some of the things that, you know, I say like capture all the headlines, but you know, some of the programs I think they're just like most notable. Some of the things when you look and say, oh wow, that's happening in PPS, or wow, that's happening in schools. Like, I don't think it's a coincidence that's tied to a lot of these same people and these same individuals. Like I talked about hip hop lit earlier with Jesse, and obviously
Yeah.
Desmond at Franklin. You know, hope I
Yes.
can work with him at some point because it just does awesome stuff. Or, you know, something like the poetry contest like Slam Boo and whatnot. But
Yeah.
then, you know, we talked earlier about you're a part of Verselandia, and can you just talk about what Verselandia is and kind of like how you got involved with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Verselandia is an all high school slam. Started out in Portland Public Schools, and Literary Arts sponsors that, puts that on, organizes that, and it's just grown drastically over the past 10 years. It's hard to like put a date on when they started it. I think it's been about 10 years. Um, and now they've expanded to include schools even outside of Portland. So it's like an all high school competition, and it's competitive slam poetry. So that means they've structured it different ways, but basically students audition for it, right? And they like earn their spot at Verselandia. And so like at the at the high schools, they'd have a small competition, and then they'd qualify from there to go to the larger competition. And I got involved with that in its early days. So probably like year one or year two, I was teaching out at Roosevelt. I taught out at Roosevelt from like 2008 to 2013, I think. Um, and I'm still like in close contact with a lot of folks. Like once a writer, always a writer. They got my heart for sure. So I love my writers out there. I will work with youth from Roosevelt, poets, who just wanted like some support and coaching. Cause you know, like being a hip hop artist and a writer and a poet, you definitely notice like which kids uh, choose to use those art forms and are like seeking out that guidance and wanting it, you know? So I always use hip hop. I don't want to say before it was trendy, but before it was trendy in schools. So we're talking like 2008, I'm getting written up by my principal, and, you know, like there's a little note, uses hip hop lyrics in her class and da da da, like in my write up, like it's inappropriate. And I'm like, man, do you not realize how you could connect with kids like that? And that is literature. Right now we got hip hop lit classes, so it's beautiful. So I ran a hip hop group kind of like after schools in the North at Roosevelt. And I taught like freshman inquiry and like freshman English out there. And so we would do open mics in class like once a week or at least once a month, depending on the class. And I just kind of open up the floor, you know, so whoever wanted to express whatever they wanted to express, they could. And we, you know, embrace that as a class, and like you develop community that way, you develop relationships. It's just like an authentic way for kids to express themselves. So that's kind of how I got started. And I would help put on the slam at Roosevelt, and I would help with other things. Like I'd work with the music teacher, and we do little community events and just you know. So this is like when I think when I first started at Roosevelt, I was working mostly with freshmen, and like Vinny Dwayne, you've probably heard of him, right? He was like a senior at the time, so he's exiting out, and then he kind of became one of the first cats I feel from the North that got like recognition, right, on a local level or beyond a local level, making hip hop. So there was like Vinny Dwayne and Glenn Waco were students there. Like I remember Glenn Waco used to like bring his raps by my classroom and like spit me his new raps, you know, like Portland girls, like back in the day raps. So, you know, I would just support students however I could. And then after he graduated, he would come back and help with that hip hop group once in a while. Or like, I think one time he brought in Mike Capes with him, you know, so just like giving kids authentic ways to connect with community and also just to express themselves. So, yeah, it's kind of how it started. That's kind of how it started. And then I think literary arts kind of saw what we were doing there asked me to do a couple workshops with kids. So like we did some workshops down at Literary Arts. We did some workshops out in the north, like at the library, just to support poets. And I think at one point I came in and I also worked with professional authors and gave them some tools for the classroom, like how to differentiate things and make it more accessible for youth. Because it's different than working with other professional authors, like how you frame things and explain them when you're working with youth. So that's kind of how I got involved with literary arts. And then throughout the years, I worked with Renee Mitchell a couple years later, and we did a different poetry, like youth poet laureate program. And Renee was like, hey, I'm gonna need some help. Like, I like what you do with the youth. We had met in Karanja Cruz's class, and I knew Karanja from Portland Teachers Program. That's where we connected, and I knew, he was a hip hop head. So he had asked, and this is like after I had left Roosevelt, because I moved out of state, came back, and Karanja was like, yo, I'm teaching this hip hop lit class. You want to come help out with it, right? So then I was back at Roosevelt, and then Renee was there working as well, like as a mentor at the time in Karanja's class. So we connected there. She was like, I got these different poetry projects going on. We did Youth Poet Laureate, and then she brought up Brave New Voices. And I had heard of it before because I had showed the videos like in my classes, because I think, it's like the largest slam poetry competition for youth in the world. And there's some really dope poets. So when she was talking, like, Portland doesn't have a Brave New Voices team. Is that something you would want to help out with? It was kind of like a natural progression, I felt, of the work that I had been doing with literary arts and just my local community. Like, yeah, let's give Portland kids the opportunity to take it like to a whole nother level, like a national level. Of course, I want to help with that. Yeah, and throughout the years, there was some changes. Renee and I had different goals. Like, I think, she's, shout out to Renee Mitchell, love her, and she's doing her thing. She earned her doctorate, and I continued with coaching that team. And so literary arts became like a sponsor, basically, for that Brave New Voices team. And we connected that with Versalandia because it just seemed like a natural progression. Like, okay, if you win your local competition, or if you're top 5 for your local competition, that earns you the stripes to audition for this team that's going to be competing at a national level. Sorry, long answer, but it's it's complicated.
Yeah, but it's it's great work, and it really speaks to a few things you said there. Like, really just speak to this this ecosystem, really, that is kind of created from just what's called just Black and brown, like, creative community, especially around the Portland area, in terms of have these people kind of like connect with the kids through this art, like you're talking about, specifically through hip hop, to where it builds those relationships and opens the door for it's not just on a hip hop level, but then coming back, having students who come back and are helping out with the kids, or maybe students, I imagine, who may have thought about becoming teachers, or even to the point actually about you also brought up the Portland Teachers Program. And again, maybe this is a bit of a stretch, but it also kind of reminds me of the sort of, when we talk about the economic aspect of the chapter. And it really, just getting back to the book, it really talks about how there's this push by a lot of people on the ground of saying, okay, but we want to get jobs in the community, specifically jobs to youth. We want, people who've been locked out of these opportunities. We want to be intentional. One of the I guess chapters, not chapters, but sections within the chapters, talking about give us the hammer and the nails, like that kind of approach. And when I think about the Portland Teachers Program, I think about like you talked about, not really being like probably like the traditional person that would be in these programs, someone who did skip school a lot, someone who,
Yeah.
Normally, but at the same time, like, I think it'd be fair to say that a lot of those experiences also help you connect with kids and probably help connect with kids who probably most need it. Is that?
Absolutely. And that was like a motivator for me. I think as a teen parent, I didn't have a lot of teachers that I connected with. Like, if anything, I felt like I already was confused identity wise, and like just growing up Latina and going to Milwaukee High School in and of itself was a challenge.
Mhm.
But to say the least, I didn't really, after I was pregnant, I didn't feel like I was supported by my teachers. I had like a great a club advisor for Latino club who really had my back, like he would bring your son to, like, bring your baby, like, it's okay, like, we're gonna do this community project, so we'd be like taking food boxes to the community, and like he was always showing love. So to me, he was really a role model, and like modeling community to me, right? And modeling like how can educators be non-traditional, like you said, like not necessarily teachers, but like him, and a supportive counselor who encouraged me to apply for Portland Teachers Program and other scholarships and whatnot. And like without the Portland Teachers Program, I don't know if I would have gone to college at that point, because the reality of raising a child as a teenager and trying to pay for school it's not easy. So for me, Portland Teachers Program like provided that opportunity to actually go to school. And it also provided an opportunity for me to use like my creativity and love for performing arts and writing, and use that as a creative outlet to help youth and be that teacher, I guess, that I didn't have. So absolutely, like that was definitely a motivator for me. Yeah. And I met a lot of amazing people that I think are still teachers, a lot of them in Portland Public Schools. Or they're doing other amazing things in the community, like Karanja mentioned him earlier. So yeah.
Yeah.
Shout out to Portland Teachers Program too. It takes a village.
And, that kind of brings up sort of more recent news because there were recently, cuts to Portland Teachers Program. I think it's still there, but the financial burden on students who go through it now is significantly higher. So, it's unfortunate. Hopefully it's not the end of that story, but
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to get off too much on that tangent, but it could be a different story if we want to talk about it in detail. But in my role with the union, with Portland Association of Teachers, as the former chair for our racial equity committee and executive board member, I've definitely had a lot of conversations with Portland Public Schools just around like what do Portland Teachers Program alumni want the program to look like versus what is the school district and PSU doing with the program. And like, it might seem silly, but even the idea of calling it Portland Teachers Program and then not involving the folks who made it what it was, the former director or like current alumni, is very un-Portland Teachers Program. Like we're all about family, community, service to others. So yeah, I hope they work it out. Like I really do hope they work it out. And yeah, we'll leave it at that.
Yeah,
it's
well, don't want to get you in trouble. That does kind of dovetail though into the other theme of this chapter, which is this idea of the politics of containment. And on one hand, from like a systemic standpoint, basically either not supporting or cutting programs that for all intents and purposes seem to be doing exactly what you would want them to do when it comes to hiring, providing opportunities for youth, providing opportunities for marginalized people who have a lot working against them. And then the other side of that is also this idea of a culture war. So I just want to read a couple of passages from the book. First, on Rap and the Culture War. Jeff Chang writes, during the 1980s, cultural conservatives had launched attacks on everything from government funding of transgressive art to campus initiatives towards multiculturalism and inclusion. But in rap music, race, generation, and pop culture all came together. By attacking hip hop, conservatives could move their culture war agenda out of the obscure congressional debates and campus academic senates into the 24-hour media spin cycle. And that sounds. And then just to skip a little ahead in the chapter, when they talk about kind of like how that kind of affects work, because they talk about the 80s. So fast forward to the 90s, in this section called Working for the Clampdown, Jeff Chang writes, major labels immediately began to reevaluate their investments in hip hop, scrutinizing their rosters for artists whose works might prove politically provocative. By the end of 1992, the witch hunt had affected dozens of major label rappers. Kool G Rap and DJ Polo's Live and Let Die album was withheld. Tragedy was forced to drop a song called Bullet about a revenge hit on a killer cop. Almighty RSO saw their single One in the Chamber lose its promotion budget after protests from the Boston Police Patrolmen's Association. The centerpiece of Booyah Tribe EP, a song called Shoot 'Em Down that condemned the acquittal of a Compton policeman who had killed two Samoan brothers with 19 shots, was shelved. Bay Area rapper Paris was signed to Tom Silverman's Tommy Boy Records, who had a distribution deal with Time Warner. The political rapper not only recorded 2 songs for his new album, Sleeping with the Enemy, Coffee, Donuts, and Death, and Bush Killer, which assassinated corrupt cops and the President Bush, but he had turned in the cover artwork which depicted him laying in wait with a gun near the White House. Paris admitted it was all agitprop. In the real world, particularly Black and Latino communities, the problem isn't cop killers, much less records about cop killers. He said, the problem is killer cops. So, yeah, sure, a little extended passage there, but it really got me thinking about just, one, this moment in time, because I feel like, that culture war has never really died. But, as someone who kind of like lived through these moments in hip hop, and kind of just general culture. One, I'm just curious, like, if you felt like that had any effect on you, kind of, at the time, and would that be like early 90s, because they also talk about like Sister Soldier and Bill Clinton and the Ice-T cop killer whole controversy.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, hearing fuck the police even would have like a very different effect on someone who never had felt that, who had never experienced that, versus, like you said, the rappers writing about those things, in the 90s, in the late 80s, early 90s, all through now, really. They're telling their stories. They're telling their reality, right? And that's that social justice aspect of hip hop that makes it, that it is real storytelling. It's oral tradition, right? So for me, growing up in Milwaukee, for example, I did experience getting pulled over at like 16, and thankfully, like, nobody was hurt. Nobody was murdered by the police, which we know is the reality, especially for Black and brown folks. But at 16, I do remember getting pulled over by Milwaukee police and having them force everyone out of my car. And my dad had taught me, officer, you always address them officer, sir, right? So I did all the things you're supposed to do. Yes, officer. Yes, sir. And excuse me, sir, can you let me know why you pulled me over? Because I didn't, there was no rule violation. I didn't break any laws. I didn't run a red light or nothing. And he said, literally, well, you guys just look suspicious. And so it was, pile all of the Mexicans out of the car, run our licenses or our IDs to see if anybody had a warrant. And that's what it was. It was that drill. So when I heard fuck the police, I was like, yeah, fuck them. Like, So for me, I feel like I could connect on some level just with, at the time, even understanding, I had friends that were beat up by the police, thankfully not killed at the time. But I could definitely connect with just that, the unjust things that were happening, right? And the reality of, like the LA riots, or like the things we were seeing on our TV for the first time, like Rodney King getting beat down by the police. It was a very different world than now, where it's like, yeah, we all know the police beat up folks or kill them, and we're seeing it constantly, like on repeat, right? What's being done about that? So for me, I recognized that. And then I also realized how, on the political landscape, there were a lot of factors, right? So you got the war on drugs, you got like Bill Clinton and his whole like, we're gonna clean this up um thing he was doing. So like Reagan and Bush, and kind of like, what did that look like when you're taking communities who are being disproportionately targeted by police, and then making hard living situations even worse, right? Like where you're disproportionately arresting Black men, taking them out of the homes, arresting Latinos, taking them out of the homes, and creating just like worse conditions for the community. Or we could talk about the difference between getting arrested for crack or getting arrested for cocaine, and how they're the same drug, but we know one at the time in the 90s very, very clearly was, crack was in Black neighborhoods and cocaine was wealthy white folks using it. So those things were super clear to me, like I was aware of them. So I saw that connection, and I think anybody connected to the streets in any way, or like who had experienced those things, understood that when they heard hip hop. I also understand how it was used politically to like say, they're poisoning our children's ears, and this is ruining the family life and ruining family values, and the way it was spun on TV. I also think it's interesting, like if you read a lot of narratives or accounts from rappers back then too, about how the labels had this increased this mediation or supervision, or really like ownership over what they could release, right? So like artists wanting to express those things couldn't really express them. We kind of went through this transition where pop and hip hop kind of came together in different ways, and like what did that mean for artists and their expression. And it's sad. And then I think it's part of a larger machine when we think about the industry, right? And and like what happened to women in hip hop, right? So we could look at the variety of women involved in hip hop in the 90s, and how that shifted pretty drastically. And I think it's all related when we talk about culture wars. Music's a powerful thing, and there very clearly was an attack on authentic hip hop back then. Yeah.
And it's kind of this sentiment that I guess there's a more consciousness right now, but I always feel like it's kind of like disconnected, because it feels like a talk amongst for lack of better terms, us old people, as opposed to like when I think about the landscape of consciousness, I really do think about, okay, yeah, but what are the students saying? What's the feeling amongst the young people? And I was curious, like from your perspective as a teacher, because I feel like I've seen a little bit of like a difference as far as like engagement with some of these topics, and especially with like social justice stuff. But again, as someone who sees them every day, do you feel like that? I guess, do you feel like this sort of like feeling of, oh, the times have really swayed? Is that overblown, or is it different now in your estimation?
Ooh, I think it's different in that, like, maybe it is more socially acceptable to use hip hop in the classroom. But I think the things that people, our students, our families, our communities are going through are very much the same, right? Like, there is a reason that the Black Lives Matter movement came about, and just because it wasn't called the Black Lives Matter movement before, doesn't mean it wasn't around. Like, we all know, like, these problems are not new problems, they're just more, they're elevated now thanks to social media, thanks to, like, people being able to see them outside of our own communities. Whereas I think back then, that kind of law and order mentality was the norm. um, I do feel like the youth that I get to work with, or that I have worked with, are more comfortable expressing themselves a lot of the time now, and expressing, you know, their anger, their frustration, their worries because of those injustices, and, like, how that affects them individually as young people. But I also think it's about creating those spaces where they feel brave spaces, right, where they can express themselves, and they see themselves as an agent of change. Like, when I work with youth, that's always in the forefront of my mind, is like, how am I encouraging them to step into their own power, to step into what motivates them, what are they passionate about. And if their family has been affected by police violence, or they have seen their friends affected by police violence, or their community, of course that's a problem, and they're going to want to change that. And we still have, all types of pushback, or culture wars, as you they called it. Like, this whole controversy over critical race theory. Like, we know critical race theory is not new. It's not something new. Like, we've been teaching it. It's not new. But it's a buzzword that Fox News picked up, and then, spun into this cycle, and people think, like, we're teaching kids to hate themselves and hate white people and whatever. That's not what CRT is. So yeah, it's different, and it's the same. Um, in a lot of ways still. I think we're still fighting a lot of the same battles around police brutality, around police violence. Um, yeah, sorry, it's been a long day.
No worries. You brought up critical race theory when we were talking about, again, this idea of the culture war in the classroom. And, the one thing I'll say is, it feels like, at least, I think there's something to, obviously there's more than presence. Just, you have to be more than just present. You have to be, intentional, and obviously all those other things. But again, kind of like getting back to just this idea of how many people in the hip hop community are, in the classroom, it kind of feels, or maybe I should ask if it's fair to say that that's, in a way, almost like a small intervention anyway in these culture wars, just because, like you said, you get to be the teacher you wish you had, right?
Yeah.
Like, so yeah, would you say, that's again, just having, just having more teachers from, especially from, like, again, sort of like this Black and brown creative community is,
Absolutely.
positive, I guess.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
absolutely. I mean, and I think, there's a lot of research that shows, like, of course, I could talk about my personal experiences and what I've seen, how that has affected youth in a positive way. But I think there's also a lot of research that shows that all youth, not just youth of color, but all youth, there are studies that show that they rate their teachers of color higher than, or as having, like, a more positive effect on their experience in school. So I think what that tells me is, like, yes, of course, we need mentors the kids can relate to, and that means more educators of color. And it also means that you know, white kids are learning from us too. And they want to connect with people that don't necessarily look like them or their mom or dad, or you know, like they want to be down, they want to learn, they want to engage. And I think there are some things that you can learn in college, and some things you can learn from experience teaching. And then there are some things that are just kind of those unspoken cultural norms, right? Like that we have within our own cultures, whether you're talking like the Black community or Mexican American community, Latino communities, right? Or you're talking hip hop, right? So like, I feel like younger folks of color, and I don't want to generalize because this is a generalized statement, but there are certain ways that we communicate that are normalized in our classrooms that I think if you go into a traditional classroom, you're not likely to see. So like, you don't have to raise your hand in my class. We're going to have like an organized a conversation, and we're going to have a circle, and maybe there is some overlap, but like there's relationships that have been built, and students know that they take turns talking, and I don't need to be the one in power calling on them, and now it's your turn, and now it's your turn. They can do that themselves. Like they're young adults, right? Or if we're doing something creative, like creating campaigns for something that they feel passionately about, a social justice topic or whatever. Like maybe they're using hashtags and creating banners, and you know, they're connecting it to their reality. That's still literacy, right? Even if we're using hashtags and we're writing raps and we're, you know, we're doing open mics. Absolutely, I think kids need that opportunity, and they need for those types of cultural norms and expressions of creativity to be validated in schools, because that's like culturally responsive education. You know, if they're always sit down, be quiet, and listen to the teacher, like that's not even learning. That's not education. That's reciting somebody else's ideas, which is not helpful in the real world, in my opinion.
Right. Well, yeah, I think that's a perfect place to wrap up on. But yeah, Jacque, thanks you again for taking the time and, you know, sharing some of your story and sharing just again, I really do think like these insights, especially on young people, are so important just because we do a lot of talking about them without talking to them. So, you know.
Yeah, nothing about us without us, right? Like, absolutely, that applies to youth. So, absolutely. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure. Hope some of that was helpful.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely.